Welcome to Uncomfortable, conversations about culture and Christianity. My name is Eric, and today I'm joined by Jess.
Hello, world.
And Alex.
Hey there, everybody.
Hey there, everybody. That's a good greeting. That's a really swell way to greet everybody all at once.
Just excited to be here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think mine also counts as that.
Yeah, yours is very good, too.
We love your greeting.
I like yours, too.
Thank you.
Even though it changes.
Good job, Eric.
Thank you. School is back, and people are going back to school. That's the rumor on the street. We spent a whole podcast talking about school last week, and we really, I think we really cleared up a lot of mess for people. But now they're sending their kids to school.
I saw some cute pictures of your kids.
My kids, they
going back to school.
Yeah, we had a first grade and a third grader go back to school today, so that was exciting. Follow me on Instagram and you can see those pictures just referred to.
Did you get your kids permission to post those photos?
He's turning red, everyone.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, that's it. No,
question.
I just figured we try to reference as many past episodes as we can. Yeah.
You're not posting any.
No, I'll just do the thing like Reese Witherspoon where I just have the kid hold the plaque in front of their face that says what grade they're in. And then
oh, yeah. We could do that. Then we could still see the cute outfit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
what really matters. So
my kids are going back next week, and I went back to school shopping for the first time because from last week, obviously everyone knows I was homeschooled my whole life. I never went back to school shopping. I never had a list of things I needed, so it was fun.
Yeah, that is fun.
Yep.
So
first grader, and I went
school supplies and clothes, or just like everything.
Yep, all the things. It was so fun. I had a great time.
I always liked picking out the backpack with them. I thought that was fun. I remember one year my son picked out a pepperoni pizza backpack where it just looked like pepperoni pizza.
I love it.
That was pretty cool. It's fun stuff.
It's Pokemon this year for us.
Yeah, my kids don't go back to school till Thursday next. This upcoming Thursday. Yeah.
Wow, that's nice. So I have a question. Thinking of back to school today.
Okay.
What grade? So we've all got kids in school, and that got me thinking. What was my best grade? Like, what grade? If I could go back right now and repeat that grade for whatever reason. So it doesn't have to be because you got the best grades, or maybe the girl you had a crush on actually liked you, or whatever it might be. What grade?
If I had to repeat it just one more time?
If you had to just repeat it. If you could go back to live that year again right now.
Do I get to do it better or change it? Or
no,
just
the same.
Whatever.
You can give us the reason why you would. So maybe you want to relive it, because you'd make other choices, or maybe you just loved it and you want to do it again.
Okay, I know.
All right.
Second grade, Miss Miller, Wichita, Kansas.
Shout out to Miss Miller.
She was the most encouraging of my creativity I ever had in any teacher. She identified that part of me really quick, and I remember she would let me write plays for the class to put on. And so I would go home, my sister would help me write scripts. I'd take them back. And then when students would have parts and we'd act out these plays. I mean, she just let me have creative control over different things that no teacher ever, I remember specifically because third grade, the next year, I had a much more practical teacher who was having to talk to my parents about disciplinary issues because I just couldn't focus, But that second grade, Miss Miller, she figured me out. It was good. All my plays were references to Back to the Future and stuff like that, but still,
awesome.
It was fun.
About you, Jess?
I think mine would be my senior year.
Did you how did you know when you were going to the next
Stop. See, guys, this is what happens when you're homeschooled. You get made fun of.
No, I'm genuinely
even when you're
curious.
37.
It's always do you take it as an insult or a compliment when people are oh, I never would have guessed.
I feel like
that you were homeschooled.
From Alex, because we're friends and he gets permission to say that kind of stuff to me. It's fine.
No, our kids
other people,
are
I'd be like, what?
Some of our best friends, my kids' best friends, are homeschooled, so.
So it's out of love.
Yeah.
I get it. So I don't know how I got to senior year then, I guess. No, I just feel like it was a school year. So I just it was just nostalgic for me. So I just remember I had great friends. I did plan a basketball team all through high school. So I was on varsity, just good friendships. I had a great basketball coach that was super encouraging. And I had a little more freedom, a job I liked. It was probably all encompassing for me.
Yeah.
It was just
overall experience.
Nostalgia. Yeah, I'd do that again.
Fun.
I think for me, it'd probably be freshman year. Freshman year, I mean, it was the first time in high school. I just remember, like, feel like I made a lot of friends. I was nervous about that because I had gone to 2 different schools in middle school back-to-back years. So just a lot of anxiety, nerves. Like, it was my first year playing football, like with pads on, like for a big school. I never thought I'd make the team because I didn't go to all the camps and I wasn't raised at that school. So like making the basketball team. So a lot of my identity, I think, came from that year, but then I think it really set up, what the rest of high school was like and the friend groups and things like that. So freshman year was fun. So
that seems like an unlikely answer for
I know,
most people.
I was thinking
Freshman
that
year
too.
has always seemed like traditionally people would think of that as a very rough year. For
It seems
people.
like the biggest transition. So I'm glad you had a good one.
Yeah.
thank you. I'm glad I did as well.
We're really happy for you. That's all good. I hope
I'd love
all
to hear
of
from our listeners. Like, if they could,
that's true.
Yeah,
If
that's
they could
true.
tell us what year was your
What's the
favorite
best?
and why, maybe we'll even put this on the gram. And
Maybe you
ask.
want to tell us your worst and why.
Yeah.
We'll listen to that too.
Yep.
Yeah, I am curious.
All right, up next, we got headlines. Our first headline comes from WOWT.com. If you're not familiar with the local Omaha area, then that's our news, one of them.
Wow.
We actually have 3 newses. That's what they say. No, we have more than that.
Yeah, we have more than that.
We
Yeah.
have more. 4?
I
5.
think at least 4 like networks, because you've got CBS, you've got
Can you name all the call letters, though?
the Peacock.
Yeah, that's WOWT.
Yeah, so you've got WOWT, KETV, channel
Okay, there you go.
7,
That's-
which is ABC.
What's
you've
the-
got KMTV,
That's
which is
Fox.
channel 3, and then KMTV
oh,
is
that's
channel
CBS.
is CBS,
Yeah.
and then you've got Fox 42 Kids Show. I don't know. What is Fox?
I can't think of their call letters.
It's on at 9, so
Anyways,
Well,
it's fine.
they set themselves apart that way.
All right.
What did that article
So
say?
maybe I should read the headline
Yeah,
of this.
let's
I
do
got
it.
really distracted. Omaha's new Detox Sober Lounge to offer bar experience without the booze. So that sounds fun. It says this business idea is geared towards those who are sober and in recovery, but is open to anyone who wants to have a night out without alcohol.
Yeah, and I know it said they've been doing these pop-up things, and so the gal who is starting this has a history with drug abuse and things like that, and she's been sober for a few years now, and so I think they've been trying this out in like a pop-up kind of location, and now they're like, hey, we've gotten enough momentum, we're going to really open our own bar for this, and it's something I never even considered. But as they interviewed a few different people for, I think I saw a video on the GoFundMe where they're trying to raise some money for this. A lot of the people are like, that's one of the most difficult parts for us is not having community anymore, because the bar scene was not just a place where we had fun or abused substance, but also where we did life and watched football games and played games and did all that kind of stuff. So
I definitely had mixed feelings with this because I work with addicts as part of my job, as part of my counseling, and I also run an addictions group, and so I see pros and cons to this. I actually took this article and I brought it to my addictions group this last week, and I just read it for them, and I was like, what are your thoughts, like, as the coming from you, like, what do you think? And all of them were like, this would be a huge trigger for me. This would be something where I wouldn't feel comfortable, and it's a lot of even going to a bar and having it called a bar and doing something like playing darts or pool in that setting is very triggering. And they said, I'd probably or somebody would at some point like bring something with them, because it's very, I think for a lot of addicts, it's like we need to be done like cold turkey. And as a process, like that's something that needs to be given up. That's a behavior that leads to something else.
Yeah.
And so they said a lot of times for them, it would feel like we're doing all the behaviors without alcohol. And so that's something that it's just another step that you could easily take back to go back there. So I think there's both, because I think it's triggering for sure. But I see the heart and I see the method behind this. And so I will be interested to see if it lasts, if it's popular. It's like you said, it's something that we don't have here. It's something that, I mean, it's interesting to me that they're also calling it a bar. Like there's just very similar terminology that's being used around it. And so I think we just have to be careful with stuff like that. And
they're going to have mocktails, tacos, a jukebox, pool, darts,
and
some board games.
Yeah. Like, so I have an uncle that is, sober, and he I think for over 10 years now, and pool is like a thing he loves. And so for a long time, and he loved it even before, alcohol. And so for a long time, he felt like there was not even a place he could go play pool, because most of the time pool, or like billiards or darts, to even be able to play other people that are skilled or do it a lot, are at a bar, and so there's not a lot of, I mean, he's not going to go to like Chuck E. Cheese and play, and I don't even think they have that there. And so I think for,
that's a different
someone, someone like that, I can think, hey, I could see him going there. I haven't talked to him about this yet, but I can see people that they maybe love something, and that is, maybe it does, and I can see how it ties back the nostalgia to bad moments, but also there's redemption and a place to belong and feel like, hey, I can still contribute to a part of these things. And
it takes me back to like my early 20s. There was a place in Papillion called The Rock. And my band would always play there, and it was like more of a Christian venue, so they just had like a coffee shop, and but it was like it felt like that vibe, like it felt like a club. It was, and it's still, there's no alcohol, but I do think there's probably a place for it, but I'd see it being more of a draw to probably a younger demographic of people who are underage, maybe, who are looking for places to hang out and get together. But I don't know.
It's also one of those things where it's new, so we kind of have opinions based on our experience or maybe how we would do it, and so we don't have something like this here. So I see the concept of community and building relationships, and so I hope it's successful.
And location probably matters too. I mean, because there's only one of them, so Omaha's a pretty spread out city. So to probably get to there, I think it's 72nd and Blondo, and so
it's kind of somewhat central.
But there's probably, I mean, if there are multiple around, then probably better chances that that kind of scene would catch on in a bigger way than just only having one.
Maybe we should just start having meetings there as a staff.
Maybe we'll podcast from there.
Do a podcast from, see what it's like.
Yep.
All right. Up next, we're going to be discussing postmodernism with the one and only Mark Ashton. Thanks, Mark, for joining us for this conversation about postmodernism and faith. It's been a little while since we've had you on the podcast, so it's good.
Thanks
to have
for
you
having
back.
me back.
Yeah.
You always feel better when you get invited back somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
The first time's not, or second time means you did okay.
Well, we took a month off, and then you took a month off, and so that's like a
Here we are.
It's a double whammy.
Yeah.
So before we get too far into this, the term postmodernism, it has all kinds of connotations that come along with it. I mean, it's used to describe a lot of things. And I thought maybe it'd be good, Jess, you had an experience where kind of your first, introduction to the term and what almost kind of painted your view of what that meant. If you want to share that kind of as we set us up.
So when we were prepping for this episode, I had emailed Mark, and Mark, you brought up the idea of maybe having this conversation today. And it was like instantly when I saw the name or the word postmodernism, I was back to like when I was 15 or 16 and having my first experience with that word. And so for me, I went to a really legalistic church, and I was kind of coming into this space where I was maybe more exploring the world and being creative. And there was just a music group that I wanted to listen to. And my parents kind of had a problem with it. It wasn't anything bad. It was a boy band.
Which one?
We'll let you guess.
Yeah. Come on.
Backstreet or
It was Backstreet Boys.
Oh, okay.
I'm Backstreet Boys all the way, and you are too.
I am
Stop.
too, but my parents never even questioned Backstreet. NSYNC.
I know. But it was one of those things where that term was used on me at my church, where I had to I ended up having to print out the lyrics. They wanted me to write a paper about it. And it was one of those things where it was this is theology, and this is the doctrine of kind of how we do things. And how does this fit into what we're doing? This is very postmodern of you to want
listen to secular
to listen to secular music, to kind of do something different. And how am I trying to fit my religion into what I want to do. So it was almost seen as like a rebellious thing. So I think as we're starting this conversation, even hearing the word postmodernism, all of us probably can think of something that's happened in our lives, like me, where we first heard it or we have this impression of what it means. But I think it's important when we're having this conversation to define it. So, what do you think?
If I were to just look at the Google definition, it says postmodernism is a broad movement that developed in the mid to late 20th century across philosophy, the arts, architecture, and criticism, marking a departure from modernism. But it also, it also applies to faith. It applies to just, a worldview in general. So,
and I think like a lot of things that started trickling in from the philosophical culture in the mid-century into popular culture in the 80s, 90s, and just has become more prevalent today. So if you're under 30, it's kind of like that's the water you swim in. Like you don't even know that it's all around you. If you're, an old dude like me, you can say, I can remember when people didn't really think this way. And some of the newer ways of thinking that have their foundation in postmodernism, you go, never saw that coming because there's been a significant shift from modernism to postmodernism in my lifetime.
Yeah.
So as we're talking about postmodernism and we're bringing the faith aspect in it, how would you define, like, just so we know, if people are like, hey, there's a 10-lane highway we call postmodernism, which one are we settling in on to like help people know, okay, this is what we're talking about, this is how it affects our circle, the church, and things like that?
Yeah. Well, I think postmodernism in its essence is a shift. It's a reaction against modernism, which was the prevailing culture for a long time. So just to take it back a little bit in history, you get back to 18th and 19th century, you've got the Enlightenment, you've got the scientific revolution, you have this idea that the truth is out there, it can be known. And if you say the priests or the sages of the modernistic era were mathematicians and scientists. And a lot of people thought because truth is out there, we can discover it. You see the Industrial Revolution, you see a lot of scientific progress taking place, and it became the new foundation for a vastly quick-moving technological advancement, and a sense that, because of transportation, medical care, computers, all these things, we're better off because modernism has come into play. So in the wake of that, postmodernism comes into play, and it's a rejection of a lot of the things that there were in the modern revolution. It's in essence asking questions that are a step removed, a step deeper than what was happening in modernism, saying, how do we know that we can know these things? How do we know that we can trust our senses? How do we know that science is really reliable? And it's asking the next philosophical question deeper that says, maybe we can't trust external truth as our best standard, but instead it depends a lot on your perspective. It depends on your experience, and the background that you came from taints everything that you know, including, and this is kind of the essence of it all, including the meaning of words, making communication of objective truth incredibly difficult.
Which in some ways you could almost look at it as postmodernism. When you look at religion, in a way religion is almost, I guess modernism was kind of thwarting religion in a lot of ways, because it was saying, let's look at the facts and the science behind this, where postmodernism is a way of kind of looking at, is it really all this? Can we find all the answers to life's questions in science? And postmodernism kind of brings up, well, maybe not. Let's find out. So in some ways, and I think that's part of this conversation too, because like with Jess's experience, it was almost solely that term was negative bad,
right?
And it's like this isn't a bad or good. There's good and bad, but it's like a way that we look at the world and the way we view things, and the lens we view it through.
Yeah, and I think the biggest challenge for modernism, just for perspective, is that because of science and scientific advancement, people began writing out the need for God. They would say, if we can explain everything logically, intellectually, scientifically, then the God of the gaps, which is all the stuff we can't explain, well, the more we can explain, the less we need God, which is faulty logic in and of itself. But it was the danger of modernism of explaining away God based on rational thought.
It's good.
So I think there's a few markers of postmodernism versus modernism that I think maybe are just highlighted in the difference. And so I think we kind of put together a little bit of a list, but like it seems like in postmodernism, the value of experience is valued highly over reason, subjectivity over objectivity, spirituality over religion, images over words, outward over inward. And I think in probably all of those ways, I even think of how the church uses, we want to give people experiences, right? And that seems to be a value of a postmodern culture over reason or maybe logic and things like that. So how would you say that even that journey towards longing for more experience over reason is helpful towards the church? And then how do you feel it's damaging, towards the church and our ways that we understand scripture and we build theology, really?
Yeah, there's a whole host of things there. One of the things I think that really is true that postmodernists get right is that an experience with God is going to be a lot more long-lasting than a philosophical argument. So you can make a philosophy or historical or other kind of biblical argument, and it could stick with a person for a while. But man, if they've had a real, live, life-changing experience with God, it's going to stick with them a lot longer, and it's going to be sticky on their internal world, not their external world.
Yeah.
So I think that's something that's a real plus side of postmodernism. The minus side is that experience can be incredibly deceptive. One of the Proverbs says that the heart is deceitful above all things. And so people could have experiences and write all kinds of meaning in from their own minds that's divorced from something that's objectively true. And they say, because of this experience, I reject God, or because of this experience, I see God as, and it's something that God is not like for real. But when you become the measurement of all things that are truth, all things that you're going to believe, when you're your own measuring stick, you have no accountability to be able to get towards something that's right. So that's one of the dangers that's out there.
That's helpful.
I find one of the things I find in explaining matters of faith to people is that the emerging generation is caught in the crosshairs of modernism and postmodernism. So a lot of them will say, I've rejected faith because of, and they'll say a scientific reason, or they'll say a philosophical reason that's connected to truth. Then there are others who find that utterly unpersuasive both ways, and they say, for me, it's actually a matter of power, or it's a matter of justice, or it's a matter of, I just have friends who believe this, and I don't want to disagree with them. And in the postmodern perspective, because that's your experience, that's the most valid thing. And so we're really addressing two audiences with multiple objections to the faith these days.
And you bring up power, and I think that's one of the arguments that come into play when it's looked at as from the context of morality.
Yes.
Where it's, what is morality and who decides that? Is it biblical morality? Is it, does human do humans have moral nature that's just, a level 0 where they're good or bad, that kind of conversation. And when and I think a lot of times then it becomes this younger generation's motivation to come in and go, well, okay, they have power, so that means that they are going to, because they have fact or truth, and then they're going to use that to manipulate others or the lower class. And so with that, we sometimes see these, questioning of authority, which can be looked at as a postmodern construct, even though it's probably not solely that. Yeah. But let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's interesting, is how that plays into morality and in a postmodern world. Because I mean, there were Christians when America had slavery, and you look at someone who was a slave owner, his morality had to have been okay with that to a certain extent, even though it was, I would even argue, biblically wrong for him to own a human. But so where is it potential that even in modern society, as modern Christians, are there things that we partake of that our morality is written around our culture, not solely off scripture? So then that stuff becomes acceptable.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. And it's really true that people throughout history have abused their morality through power. Slavery is just one of the really, really obvious examples. that's out there of ways power has been abused and people justify it morally. Now, at the time, there were some Christians who would own slaves, and there were some Christians who were fighting desperately against slavery. That's part of the narrative that gets forgotten is, that there are hundreds of thousands of white people who died in order to end slavery in the Civil War. So you have both perspectives that are out there with that. But what's really clear is that power was deeply abused during that time and justified, sometimes even justified biblically, and it's a horrific thing. Now, the postmodern viewpoint oftentimes says, well, the solution to that is to change the power structure so that the other people are now in power and they become the abusers.
Okay.
Now, the answer to that is no, it's not to change who the abuser is. It's to be able to consider all people created in the image of God, that all people are valuable, that all people deserve opportunity, that all people deserve justice. And you say, as human beings, we're not a two-tiered system.
Right.
And one of the things you see right now in the postmodern movement is minority voices should be heard more than majority voices because they were abused. And I think a more biblical viewpoint is that everybody should be heard equally, and those who are in power should be raising those who are powerless to a position where they have all equality, all the ground is equal at the foot of the cross.
I mean, it's very similar to what MLK would have said with it's the content of the character, not the color of the skin type of thing, where he's stressing he's stressing to the humanity, the thing we share, instead of the differences that are kind of just obvious on the surface.
So true. And it's not lost on me, at least, that Martin Luther King Jr. was a young black pastor with a profoundly biblical worldview. Yeah. And he was bringing that to bear on a culture that needed some corrections. Yeah. And I think he's just one of our outstanding models of not modern, not postmodern, just really going after a biblical framework.
I think another hallmark of postmodernism is, and I think sometimes we label these two things the same, is skepticism. And so you mentioned in modernism, we were really trying to find answers. We used science, we used reason, a lot of these things to help navigate what truth equals. And I think there's confusion sometimes over the health of skepticism, like to see, vaccinate, we're seeing it all over, like in a vaccination and all of these types of things. Skepticism towards faith, whatever that might look like, skepticism towards leaders or churches because of, fallen leaders, and then there's doubt. And I think a lot of times people want to marry those two words, that skepticism is doubt, and if you are skeptic, you're inherently doubting. If you're doubting, you're inherently a skeptic. And so how would you say those things are different? We talked a couple weeks ago about doubt, and even as Christians, sometimes it feels like there's not permission to doubt. And I think part of that is because if you doubt, you're labeled a skeptic, towards your faith, and just have a little bit more faith, add a little more faith to it, and you can move mountains. And so how would you navigate or differentiate those two things and say, one, are they different or are they the same? And is one more healthy than the other? How do we navigate that as Christians? Am I doubting this, or am I just skeptical of it?
That's good. Yeah, you won't be around Christ community too long without hearing me affirm doubters and say doubt, I think, is a really, really good thing. Even this week, doubting your salvation is a good thing if it drives you towards finding deeper answers. So one of the things that doubt does, none of us is born wise. And when you say, hey, I'm doubting that that's really true, well, if you do a healthy job of searching for answers, it leaves you in a much more solid place in the end. And that's the way that you put layer of wisdom onto your life and can build a compelling worldview. I think skepticism is the idea that says, well, I'm doubtful, but I don't really think there's any answers, so I won't engage in them. I'm going to disbelieve without the evidence that's behind it. And when you get to a place where you disbelieve without evidence, then you're saying, I'm not open to being persuaded, I'm not open to learning, I'm not open to growing, I'm not open to a fresh work of God in my life. And that can be very damaging for a person, because truth is, all of us are ignorant on an awful lot of things, and doubt leads to growth.
And skepticism, I feel like, almost leads to cynicism, which is once you're there, it's hard to come back from. I'm just thinking because in our conversation, so my sister is 21. She just turned 22. And I'm finding with a lot of her friends, a lot of this younger generation of Generation Y, that there is this longing for like a deep theology and getting back to the roots of, the greats that have written, the books that we read or the doctrine that we're looking at, and how does that interact? How does postmodernism interact with getting back to the theological roots of what's going on, or how can they interact?
Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of different categories we could go through. I'll tackle one of them off the top, the idea of Scripture. So a standard evangelical viewpoint is that Scripture is trustworthy, that it actually points us towards truth. Personally, I don't like the word inerrant for a variety of historical reasons, but I do like the word trustworthy. It's a place that you can find answers. It's our basis of belief and practice. But if you don't believe that there's truth contained in the Scripture, truth that's beyond me, that I'm not searching the Scripture for something that I need to align to. Instead, the postmodern idea is I'm bringing my experience, language, and perspective to another person's experience, language, and perspective. We're folding them over each other and seeing what happens. But there's not actually a direction to which I'm headed. So under the modern perspective, this is where I was trained. You have something like inductive Bible study, which asks 3 questions. What does it say? What does it mean to the original audience? And then what does it mean to me today? Well, that assumes that there's an objective truth that's out there. The postmodern perspective asks, what was the experience of the author? What's my experience? And what do I feel in the midst of this? What are the conclusions that I can come to? But there's not a sense that there's a real conclusion that I'm trying to come to about a real God who really is one way and not another way. It's just, how does my experience intersect with it? So it has a profound impact on your ability to wrestle with even the nature of, is there doctrine that's really, really true? Is there characteristics of God that are really, really true? When we say words like just and merciful and compassionate and loving, we think that we're communicating pretty well from a modernist perspective. We think we know what we mean when we talk to each other. The postmodernist questions all of those pieces of language and says, well, we may be talking about totally different things and that our communication is ineffective. So I think that there's some real challenges as a postmodern to even studying the Bible and coming to conclusions about doctrine at all.
I almost think in that as you're talking that there's so many things that us today, even our younger, like I feel like even me as a millennial and the younger generations, we are basing so much of what we have seen and learned on people that have had experiences and opinions and power based on original documents. And not a lot of us have taken the time to go back ourselves to say, okay, there's 50 books that have been written in between this original text and where I am today. And so it's almost like, okay, digging deeper of, okay, where does this really come from, and questioning. It's almost in a way breaking a cycle in some ways of getting back to why do I think the way I think, or something like that. So
it's good. That's really good.
One of the key words that have kind of overtaken postmodernity conversations is woke. And it seems like that word gets used either in a negative context or a positive context. In some cases, a lot of times I think it's just used as a way to maybe, throw someone, discredit someone's opinion or something. Oh, okay, well, this is just your woke theology, or you're trying to be part of the woke mob or whatever. What does that mean though for us? Is it good for us to use that word in a way that's hurtful? I would assume not, but also in a postmodern sense, is it something that we should maybe at least try to hear where people are coming from when they use that word and their heart behind it?
Yeah. It's even a funny question to ask, because in the postmodern perspective, you ask, does the word woke have any meaning? And when people who are from a postmodern perspective get offended at a particular word, you go, well, that word is meaningless anyway. But, that's just kind of the humor, some of the self-referential humor that's there behind it.
Yeah.
But the word woke actually came out of the liberal academy. I mean, that's the place that the origins of the word was. But I hear it mostly used on conservative news programs. as a way of, critiquing people who are in that more liberal camp and who are thinking differently about history and theology and all kinds of other things. And, Eric, I'd probably agree with you that using hurtful terms towards other people is not a helpful thing to do.
Yeah.
And when we critique people by name calling them, it's not persuasive, it's not helpful, it's not engaging with that person. All it does is draw battle lines that drive people further and further apart from each other. And for me, I believe that words really do carry meaning that are behind them, maybe not inherent meaning, but shared meaning from people who share a culture and a language grouping. And hurtful language really is powerful. Well, I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think in a postmodern world, the church is going to struggle to reach people if the older generation takes that posture right away of going, wokeness or this is bad or whatever. And then you look at the younger generation struggling with sexuality and different, identity crises that they're in. And it's almost like I think sometimes they see the church as saying, well, once you fix your silly little issues, then we've got Jesus for you here, instead of just going, here's Jesus, and so how do we, I don't know, I think sometimes that term or even just that idea of the issues of the younger generation are just almost frivolous to a mature Christian. And that's, how do we kind of work past that? And not saying that we have to endorse everything that they believe in, but also realize the pain and the hurt that they're living with.
Yeah, I think it's a wise encouragement for the older generation. One of the ways I see this is sometimes even in the dialogue that we have about postmodernism and how it works. So a postmodernist might say, really, there is no truth. There is no absolute truth. That's one of their kind of fundamental ideas. And a quick retort from somebody who's a modernist would say, well, is that statement true? And what they're pointing out is the idea that it's self-referentially incoherent. So from a logical cycle, the idea that there's no truth blows up on itself. Or words have no meaning. Well, do those words have meaning? It blows up on itself. But it's not helpful for a postmodernist to show logical flaws because at the heart of their belief system is that logic doesn't really matter, particularly when it comes from people who have power and authority. So they'll reject the logic, not because it's not logical, but because they've already pre-assumed that there is no truth. So even the things that you're saying aren't truthful or are nonsense. So it becomes a matter of modernists and postmodernists talking past each other because of the assumption that there's truth, the assumption that there is no truth. We can't even talk to each other about it. So these people will critique those as being, oh, you silly woke people who can't even think straight. Well, they have a different set of assumptions that they're beginning with. And for the modernists to assume that those silly people are just going to come our way once they grow up and learn a few things, I think is a false assumption. Their assumptions need to change in order to be able to have that kind of conversation.
Yeah, that's good.
I feel like it's just hard to navigate a lot of what we're talking about. Like, we're having a conversation, but how it kind of plays out in real life, it's a struggle for me. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I just feel like we're in a culture where I really care about loving and accepting and understanding people. I think it's one of the reasons that I'm here and that I am on this podcast is like, that's something that I want to do and how I want to live my life. But it's also something where like our culture is demanding it right now, but at the same time, there's this tension of our culture needs that, and it needs it from believers, from Christians that care. And so my tension in that, and maybe you can give some insight, is it's almost, I want to do that, but how do you navigate that and not be hypocritical at the same time?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question to ask. One of the things that we see out of the postmodern generation that I think is commendable is the idea of tolerating diversity. Like, we really should be able to tolerate each other coming from different perspectives, having dialogue, conversing about things, appreciating good things that are good about each other. But I think one of the interesting dynamics that we've seen as the culture has drifted further apart is that the culture of tolerance has actually turned into a culture of intolerance of people who disagree with their viewpoint or their assumptions. And so there's been a mean-spiritedness and a powering up that happens as a result of that. What I would encourage our Christian audience to do, whether you're postmodern or modern, is to say, tolerance is not the highest virtue. Jesus didn't say they'll know you're my disciples by the way you tolerate each other. He said they'll know you're my disciples by the way you love one another. And love takes things a big step beyond tolerance. It doesn't just say, I'm okay with you being different. It says, I want to engage in your world. I want to understand the way that you think. I want to appreciate the value that you bring to the table. And my hope is that you'll reciprocate that with me as well. And together we can journey through life and move towards things that are more real in our lives. And I think in that context of love, not just appreciating, but going this next step deeper, asking the next question, dialoguing on a more significant level, that's where we're going to see the breakthroughs in relationships. Not by lobbing bombs at each other from a culture war perspective, but by getting into relationships that are based on love and not just tolerance.
Amen.
I haven't met anybody that on their Twitter bio or their LinkedIn labels themselves a postmodern, right? And so I don't think there's a lot of people that are like, I'm postmodern. It probably more comes out in just how we were raised, the time we were born, and how that informs who we are, how we look at the world, how we do all that kind of stuff. And so, as somebody who's a dad, probably to kids who have swam and just been born and raised in a postmodern culture, I just love to hear some of those experiences where some of the thoughts that they've brought to you are challenging in good ways, maybe, or ways that you've been able to rebuttal against those. I mean, that wasn't a question we told you we were preparing for, so you don't have to name anybody, but I'm just curious, like how you've seen just that in your own kids that are getting to adult age, getting married, all that kind of stuff, who probably are seeing the world, have been raised in a different worldview than you, and it's no one's fault. It's just when they were born.
Yeah.
So are there any like conversations that you can think of, or just ongoing dialogues that are like, hey, this has helped stretch me, and I think my rebuttals have helped, stretch them in that kind of way?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things I've noticed, I'm going to be careful about not telling stories about my kids on a podcast.
Because they love that.
Yeah.
They love that.
But I'll say one of the shifts I've seen is that the issues they're dealing with in high school are very different. So Caleb, who's 27 years old right now, is somebody who was reading The New Atheists. So The God Delusion was a big book at the time. You remember the author of him? Famous atheist guy. Trying
Hawkins?
to remember.
Yeah. No, it wasn't Hawkins, but anyway.
Dawkins.
Richard Dawkins.
Hawkins is the construction company.
Oh, sorry. I knew it rhymed with Hawkins. That's what
Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
So he asked me in high school, hey, I talked to my friend about reading The Case for Christ, and he said he'd read The Case for Christ if I read The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. Is it okay if I read it? I said, sure. No problem reading other people's views. But if you run into anything that's a question for you, come and talk to me about it, and I'll help you work these kinds of things through. So he reads this big, God-hating atheist book that's there, and we're talking about all these questions. Well, Dawkins was a thorough modernist, using logic in powerful ways to be able to, deconstruct what's happening with God and with Christians. So Caleb was asking me all of those kinds of questions that his friends were dialoguing about in high school. Haven right now is my youngest, and she's at Millard North right at this time. Her friends are asking all kinds of questions about race and about power and about history and about LGBT. And nobody's reading Richard Dawkins anymore. Nobody's asking those kinds of questions about the philosophical underpinnings of the existence of God, at least not asking her right now. So I see the kinds of questions that she's bringing to the table as she interacts with her friends are just a whole different category of questions that are being asked.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think in youth ministry, even being in that for a decade, the apologetic has kind of changed in some ways. We always need to be ready to have an answer for the faith that we have, but it seems like a lot of the questions previously, like I was an intern here when Caleb was in high school, were around logic and science and fact and where did this all come from kinds of things. And it seems like now a lot of the apologetic that a Christian has to dispose of is how does the church, how does the church in general get labeled as hateful,
Right.
towards certain communities, or not value diversity and things like that. And so they're seeing, leaders fall that have been, Christian leaders uncovered some of their junk that they've been oppressing people. And so it seems like the problem isn't with logic and the beliefs necessarily of how is God existent. Was the world created in 7 days or not? But it's more like, well, I read your scripture and it's attractive, and I see some of the people and they're not as attractive as that scripture, and so I even hear a lot of people have that kind of conversation, and sometimes their view of who Jesus was is marred a little bit and maybe fantastical, and don't always get into the truth of who Jesus was and the truth that he did speak about sin and things like that. But it does seem like, and that's not even that long of a time, between Caleb and your youngest, but it is fascinating how that's even. So do you think that's like we're part of this birth of postmodernism right now? I mean, are they living in two different thoughts? Yeah. Your two children?
Boy, that's a great question. They talk with each other about these kinds of issues all the time, and I think that there's kind of a flood that's melding, the two worlds together in that generation. I do think that there's going to be a kickback against postmodernism, just like there was a kickback against modernism. And I think culture is changing faster than it ever has. So we were in a pre-modern worldview from, all the way from the beginning to the 1800s. And then it took 150 years to get towards the beginnings of postmodernism. I think the new wave will come in even faster than that. And in our lifetimes, we'll be watching a reaction against postmodernism as well. I don't have a prediction for what that's going to look like. But it's one of the things that makes me say, holding fast to a biblical worldview as much as we can, because we are all a product of whatever environment we were raised in, the water that we swim in, but doing as best we can to hold true to a biblical worldview will help us, because it's the thing that doesn't change while the waters of culture around us do swirl, depending on what world you're from.
That's fascinating.
Well, and I think even maybe to almost bring it back to the beginning of this conversation, you look at, what you just said is looking at it from a biblical worldview. You consider people who would have been going through the Civil War and the emotions and the thoughts and the everything that we can look back now with perspective and go, obviously slavery was bad, but you had two sides who were conflicting on that. And I think now, like, as Christians, it's almost like if we can hold fast to the biblical teachings that we have, we can kind of, in some ways, almost protect ourselves from what's going on in the world and try to seek the wisdom out of that. And almost, I don't know what metaphor you want to use, whether it's a cruise liner or an airplane or something, but you're kind of, in a way, kind of coasting over all these changes and these this modernism, postmodernism. And I think the term, I was looking at it before this podcast, is meta-modernism, which is actually like a critique of postmodernism. So it's just, it's going to constantly be evolving, but I do think that we can always align with the biblical truths that we have to rally against the injustices in the world that we see, but also, stay true to what we believe.
Man, that's really good. One of the things I've been thinking about a little bit waiting on this podcast is the modernist sees truth as external to themselves. The truth is out there. The postmodernist sees truth as internal. Like, I determine my truth, I determine my reality, and reality conforms to my opinions. But Jesus didn't have either of those thoughts in mind. He didn't tell people, you want to conform to an external truth. He didn't say truth is inside of you. What he said is, I am the truth. And so, there have been many sages and wise people over the years who will say, I will point you to the truth. I will teach you the truth. One of the things that makes Jesus unique is he says, I am the truth. And what he's saying is more foundational than this universe, more foundational than existence, more foundational than being or thought or spirit is me. I was before it all and through it all, and I'm going to be here after everything is done. And so as much as we can become wrapped up in another person, not a system, not a doctrine, not a set of covenants or scriptures or things like that, but get wrapped up in a person who embodies the truth, that's where we're going to find our best anchor.
Yeah. Well, and I think we just live in a culture, even in the last 2 years, in the middle of a pandemic, where people are craving truth. They're craving a source of truth more than ever, but it seems more difficult to be found. And you're even starting to find out, like, people that you thought were once trustworthy, you're labeling them not trustworthy because of their stance on, science and a vaccination and what doctor they're listening to or what kind. And so even it seems like the scientific world feels like it's getting disrupted more and more. And part of that's because science is continuing to evolve and learn about mutations of even this disease and all that kind of stuff, and it's like doing things on the run and rebuttaling themselves, and the CDC comes out with a thing, and then it seems like they come out with something rejecting themselves, and so it leaves people in this space of, well, I'm just totally going to reject science. All of it is them trying to manipulate me, or people beginning to worship it, in an unholy kind of way, I think, as well. And so it's just this difficult. I think what's going to happen on the back end of a pandemic, I can't predict, but I think it is probably going to speed up a lot of that whatever you said. Metamodernism, and it's going to even create a bigger, probably split, because now people are able to, more than ever, share their opinions on these kinds of things. So you're able to label people probably easier, and people label themselves more easily because of just how accessible we are in individualism to putting our own thoughts out there and thinking everybody needs our thoughts. And so it's just fascinating, even that in the middle of this pandemic, I think how it's going to even accelerate, that next narrative more and more.
Yeah. I think there's also some things that are sectioning off people in our culture more and more. And I know, Alex, you and I have talked about this personally before, but social media itself, the algorithms get you towards seeing more exposure to the things you agree with and less exposure to the things that you disagree with, leaving everybody in an echo chamber. And that could be a modern, postmodern, it could be a liberal and conservative, it could be a Christian and non-Christian, but you wind up seeing more and more, and the words get stronger and stronger, but less and less checked. So people say more and more divisive and mean-spirited things about people because of that. That's force number one. Force number two is the 24-hour news media that feels compelled to, or is compelled to have news stories all the time. So they start commenting on their stories, and they start commenting on other people's stories, and then criticizing the other news stations. And pretty soon it's just a kind of a war of how you spin news with one another. And people will choose their news source and wind up going into their corner. So they only hear this spin on the facts with a hypercritique, or this spin on the facts with a hypercritique. And it's amazing how divisive that is in our culture in all different kinds of ways.
Yeah. Well, and what's fascinating to me, and even how that plays into Christian life in general, is just how people will just co-opt anything that they agree with. So it's like, oh, well, I agree with that person because maybe I'm scared of change, or I'm scared of this, so I'm going to just co-opt this into my own identity, and I identify as a Christian, so then this becomes a Christian value by proxy, which is absolutely false. Yeah. But that narrative is just written every day, all the time, and it's tarnishing even Christians' reputations, which is frustrating, which has been happening for a long time in general. It's something we can't avoid, but it's also one of the things I just think we need to be very cautious of, is those subjects that we co-opt into Christianity by going, oh, okay, well, I agree with this, so it must be the same.
Yeah.
I think there's also, through this, a lot of pain involved. There's growing pains of, I'm thinking different, and I'm questioning things that my parents have taught me, or my grandparents, or an influence that I've had. And I think relationships breaking or disagreements, I mean, this thinking and questioning can cause huge wedges in families and relationships, or they're gone. And so I think it is so important that we can go back to scripture, to verses that say, I am with you. Like, you can trust me. Like, when you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And I think that's so important to keep in mind, like what the Bible says and the promises of the word, because there is pain as we are breaking cycles, or as we are questioning. And even, I mean, relationships are so important. We need to have a relationship with the Lord. I mean, it's so obvious in this conversation that we're having. That's imperative as we're navigating these things. And just a lot.
One other thing I would say that I think is imperative as we have this conversation is one of the gifts of the postmodern culture is the care for the marginalized, and thinking about people who have traditionally not had a voice or traditionally not had power, and saying, how can we empower them? And as Christians with a biblical worldview begin thinking about that, I think that's one of the things we need to embrace about the postmodern movement and actually reclaim, because it was a Christian idea before it was a postmodern idea. It's 2,000 years old. It's 3,000 years old. That core to the identity of a follower of Jesus is that you care for the widow and the orphan and the prisoner and the stranger. That the aliens, who are, the foreigners who are being brought into the nation of Israel, that they are to be welcomed and treated but like somebody who's a naturalized citizen. And all of these kinds of values that feel like they're new, like they're a big change, they're actually really, really old. And they were started through a Jewish and then Christian worldview that you see in the scriptures. And as Christians, one of the things I want to say is do not react against that because it's postmodern.
Right.
That's postmodern and it's biblical, and it's one of the big bridges that we can build in culture. In fact, I would love it if Christians were known as, or for some continue to be known as, the most compassionate, generous, giving, kind-hearted, reconciling people that there are in the world.
Yeah, that's good. And I think because of, we talked about the pains of social media, but that's also given platform for us to even, I think we've been ignorant to a lot of that stuff because people didn't have cameras everywhere. There are things that have happened inside of our culture that have been terrible because of a camera being attached. And we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago, even with the gal who was Becky, who was talking about, policing right now and the pressures of that. And there's been justices that have come out of that, but then there's also been a lack of respect and authority. And same with, the world, because people are connected to the internet now. They're able to tell their stories. Even in the Olympics, a gal, I don't remember what country she was from, but they were going to just take her back to her country. And she's like, no, I don't want to go back. And the Japanese authorities are like, no, we're going to keep you here because she didn't win a gold medal or something like that. And so it was like this crazy story she was able to tell because she had, media. Or I even think of the women's NCAA this year. They were able to talk about injustices in their tournament by showing their weight room versus another one. And the change was accelerated because of that as women athletes and the difference between their tournament and the men's tournament, because they did have a voice to be able to show that. And so sometimes I'm like, I'd rather be ignorant to a lot of things that God's opened my eyes to, because now I have to care about it. And so that's frustrating at times as a Christian, because I'm like, how do I pour everything I am into all of this? It's such a mess. Where do I lean in? What area of avenue of brokenness can I even lean into, So,
yeah. Well, this has been really good. Mark, do you have any parting postmodern I feel like you've given us a lot of insight.
Yes.
Is any takeaways that you want to make sure you get out on the table before we wrap things up?
I'll throw out one more. I remember a story in the Bible about James and John coming to Jesus and saying, hey, can we sit at your right and your left hand when you come in your kingdom? And Jesus said to them, the Gentiles lord it over other people, not so with you. The greatest among you should be the servant of all. And one of the things that Jesus commanded his disciples to do is that your job is to submit, not to grab power. And if you want to be anti-modern and anti-postmodern at all the same time, give away power. Be generous with other people. Be a person who is submissive, and you'll find all of a sudden you're upending all kinds of power structures and assumptions. And Jesus is our best example of that. Jesus left the throne room of heaven for the footstool of earth. When he got here, he allowed himself to be beaten, to be taunted, to be killed on a cross, and go all the way to death on our behalf. It was this great descending into the lowest place possible. And so his invitation to us is not to power up on people, but it's power through submission and through love, and that's the way of Jesus that's counter to both of them.
Yeah.
And that's partly taking up our cross on a daily basis, because that's not natural to me,
That's
to
right.
do that on a daily basis. Like, I'm good at that some days, but every day to be considering that. And that's probably why he invites us to do that, and invites the Holy Spirit to be constantly filling us up, because if we're not, then naturally what we're going to do is the opposite, I think, of humility. And so that's a good reminder.
All right. Well, Thanks for joining us, Mark. Thanks for having this conversation. It's
Love being
good.
with you guys. Thanks.
Yeah, it's been real good. Thanks everybody for listening. If you have any postmodern questions for us, you can reach out to us on social media at CCC Omaha. Or you can send a message directly to this podcast at podcast@cccomaha.org. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, we'll talk to you then.